wrong spot.
Yeah, that's not us. They're aware. It was a test. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you. Here we go. All right, we ready? Streaming? Go. Okay. We are go. Hi, I'm Amber Balde, still. And this is the Launch Member Perspectives panel for the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So over the course of the morning so far, we've certainly started kind of down in the weeds a little bit. And we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of raise up to some kind of more vision statements and kind of understand, as enterprises that are coming into this space, what is it that we see as the opportunity, and why are we here? How did we end up here? And where do we really see that this organization is going? Which does, of course, couple and tie to the technical roadmap. But really, there's a lot more to say than just saying that this is about a reference spec. So first off, let me just go ahead and introduce the panel a little bit. So I'll pass down the line. You can introduce yourselves. And first, let's just hear kind of your name and position, where you're coming from, and how your organization got involved with Ethereum.
Dave Treat. I'm Accenture's blockchain lead, and really where this evolved from is all of our client conversations. Right? That over the past year plus, Ethereum's been a constant part of the dialogue, and the gap that Vitalik and others have talked about bridging has been central to it. So thrilled to be here. Looking forward to answering your question.
I'm Matthew Spoke. I'm founder and CEO of a Toronto-based blockchain company called Nuco. Previously lead of a blockchain team at Deloitte for a couple of years. And I guess, my involvement started with my time at Deloitte. And as a startup founder, my involvement in this initiative particularly was, kind of driven by how does a relatively small startup align themselves with the right organizations to be able to compete with the massive companies out there on new technology. And going at it alone is not all that obvious when you're dealing with, unnamed three-lettered technology companies when you're competing. But being part of a standards organization and a collaborative group like this kind of adds to the credibility and general direction of what we're building.
Hi, my name is Joseph Lubin, founder of Consensus and co-founder of Ethereum. Consensus was basically formed when it was clear to me that Ethereum would release version 1.0. I guess it was clear to me from a month in that we would get it done, but it started getting concrete, and we had this discussion about the fact that we were launching the Xbox and we didn't really have any game titles. So I set out to get some people together to start building things. We launched before there was an ecosystem, before there was a version 1 of Ethereum. It was slow going at the start. As a result, we're an oddly shaped company. We build developer tools, we build back-end infrastructure, we build a lot of things that we consider core components for public blockchain. Surprisingly, they work on private blockchain just as well. And in order to foster adoption, we found that it was valuable to start pushing this out into the world. And so 18 months ago, probably, we started getting larger and larger numbers of calls from enterprise and entrepreneurs, etc. And so we essentially formed a practice to help enterprise with their blockchain strategy, and we've built lots of software, either in partnership or as consultants.
Good morning, everyone. Sandra Rowe, CME Group. For those of you who are not familiar, CME Group is a 42 billion, thereabouts, market cap listed company. We're the most diverse derivatives marketplace in the world, with one of the largest clearing houses in the world. So we basically are, between our futures and options on futures products, we cover every asset class you can imagine. And a lot of the pricing that marks different asset classes actually come from our futures contracts. I lead our digitization efforts. We've been looking at blockchain, starting with Bitcoin several years ago, and obviously with the advent of Ethereum, we were quite interested in understanding more about how smart contracts would work, which is where we really started. We've actually conducted a few POCs, but our general policy is not to announce them publicly, so you probably haven't heard very much about what we've been doing in this space, but we are looking to help with EEA and make sure that we can come up with a collaborative way of building the next generation of hopefully enterprise-level applications and products.
Hi, I'm Wally Gray with Microsoft. I'm on the Azure Blockchain Engineering team and got started with Ethereum when the day Frontier released. Spent about 2 days pulling my hair out in the labs here in New York City, and quickly, mostly into a reaction of anticipating what Jeremy was talking about, is our enterprise customers saying, build me a blockchain, but it needs to be in purple, and needing to have an answer for doing that. And here we are today.
Is it purple yet?
Nah, still kind of mauve.
2018.
Working on it. And for this one, I guess I'll answer the question as well, just so you know what's going on. So our blockchain team at JP Morgan has grown over the past period of 2 years from being part of a larger new product development team that looked after a variety of emerging technologies. So your usual suspects around cloud, big data and machine learning, robotic process automation, API, and microservices. And initially, we were looking at blockchain because it was a bit of a pet project among some of the engineers. And I personally had also followed the space for quite some time and kept trying to figure out, there's got to be someone at the bank that's looking at this. Where are they? And I was thrilled to find out that they were here in Brooklyn, since that's where I live. But we opened this kind of innovation space. We also have one in Hudson Yards. On the west side in Manhattan. But we're able to sit next to each other between product and strategy and technology every day and function like a little startup inside this massive firm. And we don't like to call ourselves an innovation lab because sometimes that equates with it or comes with things that get developed in a lab and never make it out of the lab. So what our goal to do in the new product development team was to go out and meet with business, to meet with the heads of business across the firm. So we cover the corporate and investment bank, so wholesale banking, our markets practices, and investor and custody and fund services. And we wanted to understand, first of all, first there was what is a blockchain? We're getting a lot of emails, so we got to go answer those questions. But as people understood a little bit about the possibilities, how do we take the thinking from being, this could be a threat, or this could be a disintermediation issue, to being, what is the opportunity here? What is the business value of distributed systems to the bank as a whole? And the thinking really has started to change quite rapidly. And it's really more now about positioning, what is finance going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years? Electronification itself has been a journey for the last 30 years, just getting off of paper tickets, as I'm sure Sandra can tell you all about. Not that you've been working for 30 years, but that on the trading floor, you move from paper tickets to the electronic tickets, and that process came with it. It bled out little bit by little bit through the post-trade settlement process. But really, a lot of those systems, in a way, are still in place. And so now that we have these wonderful technologies like the litany of emerging techs I mentioned earlier, if we were starting with that toolkit, how would we have built things? And how are we going to position ourselves to not be completely disrupted, but rather to say, we have a larger value here, and that is around client service. And the just the sheer transaction volume that we do each day kind of makes the global markets work. So it's worthwhile to think about these things and to design those solutions. Okay? So that was my oration. Let's go with the questions. So alliance. Right? So across the stage, we can see that we've got major consulting firms, startups, blockchain innovators, financials, large tech vendors. And hopefully, we all kind of see ourselves as equals in this process here. So, David, I'll start with you. What does alliance mean to you?
It's been really interesting to watch. If you think back over the past, so I've been in financial services now for 20 plus years. The evolution from where we've been for the majority of that time is is whether whoever you are, right? There's a single solution. You're bringing it to a single firm. It's a single conversation. It's a bilateral kind of sales and integration and development process. It's this bilateral world. And over the past 5 years, that has blown up entirely, right? So this is now a team sport. It involves groups of participants getting together to work. Open source is now the dominant topic in all of the conversations. So the notion of this being an alliance, I think it's a very operative word. In that we need to have everyone, and as I look around the room, right, we've got all form and flavor of competitors and collaborators and different parties that are going to be required to make this real. So an alliance, as us all having a shared goal, shared outcome of ultimately making the most out of this technology and innovation and what it can mean to transform our businesses I think will transcend any of the legacy notions of competition. So it's exciting from that perspective. I think it's a very operative term and all about aligned objectives.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at kind of the crossovers, the client bases that you have, you hear kind of what's going on all over the place, as are we, and we kind of bring separate perspectives, but are able to kind of talk to each other and figure out what this should look like in a bigger picture. And Sandra, what do you think as well? What's Alliance to you?
So I saw some of you in Atlanta yesterday at a conference, and I talked a little bit about this. For me, 2017, Alliance being key to this, it's collaboration. This technology, unlike many others that we've looked at or created in the past, requires collaboration and network. You build your own, you'll be a very lonely solo party. It's not build it and they will come. It is, we need to network, we need to collaborate, we need to build this together. And I think it actually should be more, not less this year. I know there's a little bit of consortium fatigue, and I get it. There's skeptics out there saying, yet another consortium, yet another group. But when the groups have a purpose, and the groups have specific goals they want to reach, I actually think this year we need more, not less. Perhaps it's a contrarian view, but that's what I think.
Can I jump in quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the way consortia get formed is going to change. Getting a whole bunch of businesses together in a niche and trying to come to some sort of agreement on how they cooperate while they're competing with one another has been very difficult. But with this new technology, we can build systems that are collaborative by default, and we can build consortia that are small and focused to start with. One company can put their business processes on their private blockchain and enable their employees, vendors, service providers, customers to access that. But if they run into a situation where they have a counterparty that doesn't want to use their infrastructure, they can set up a shared infrastructure that they can both trust, use two counterparties, one use case, and you have the start of a consortium. You can, at that point, add members, have rules for removing members, and build a consortium one use case at a time.
Can I add something? I think I have a somewhat unique perspective because I spent my first 2 years in the blockchain space at kind of one of the larger organizations that's active at Deloitte. And then I moved over into the startup world. And I think what I've noticed is this trend kind of going both ways. You've seen a lot of people coming out of the corporate world going into the startup world. And you've also seen a lot of people coming out of the startup world going to the corporate world after these organizations have realized that there's a need for each other. There's a need for these differing perspectives. I mean, I sometimes, we use the terminology like corporate versus rebel or suit versus hoodie. And I think we're starting to see a lot more overlap between these two things. I probably fall somewhere in the middle of the corporate side of the rebel spectrum or the rebel side of the corporate spectrum, I'm not sure. But that differing perspective, if you went back to the early days of Bitcoin and even the really early days of Ethereum, I think one of the things that was lacking in the community of doers was a good, solid understanding of the problems of industry. And similarly, in industry, there was a lack of understanding of what the heck these weirdos were doing in kind of this crypto space. Now there's a lot more appreciation for each other, the realization that, as a startup, I don't know all the problems of my potential enterprise client. And as an enterprise, I don't know all of the opportunities that a startup might bring to my door. So I think, especially when you look at the makeup of not only who's sitting up here, but who's involved in this alliance to start off, it's reflective of that. We need each other. We don't come to solutions and we don't come to a positive outcome unless we work together.
Absolutely. I think that rings true for JP Morgan as well. As we did release Quorum last year, it was because we saw that there were specific issues with the public Ethereum implementation that we would need to address if we were going to be able to take this forward and move it towards a production technology within not only our bank, but the financial industry. And namely, to start, those were around privacy and permissioning, but also performance. And that's what the initial release is. And so it's out on GitHub, and we're pretty excited about that. But there's a long way to go with it. And some of those things, I think that we're uniquely poised to offer requirements or guidance around as an enterprise. But there are other things where I can say, I need something. It kind of looks like a breadbox, but I'm not really sure how this should function because we don't have the sort of core technologists that can really design the right solution in-house. And so having access to the people that really are at the heart and the core of the technical community, I think will help accelerate that much more as we get over the hubris that we need to absolutely build everything in-house because nobody can do it better than we can. We've certainly learned through some of our in-residence programs and other things that as we collaborate with startups, they bring that unique experience. And I think that's a good segue to bring Marley into the conversation around kind of blockchain as a service. And just as a large tech vendor at Microsoft, just how big do you think this is going to be worth supporting, and kind of how do you see this going from here?
Sure, yeah. So we started blockchain as a service with Ethereum, working with Consensus, and blockchain as a service is actually kind of an unfortunate name that just at the time seemed like a good acronym because everything was infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Oh, we'll call it blockchain as a service, but looking at it really doesn't make much sense when you're talking about distributed ownership and everything. But anyway, that's a nit. But what we have seen, we launched with with Ethereum, and we've attracted and really tried to open it up and with our customers wanting to try these different platforms. We've brought in R3 and Chain and a whole bunch of other platforms that we collaborate with. All of us on stage, we know what these people are doing. Watch what they're doing. Look for ways to learn and interoperate. And so we're sort of embracing all of that, but then looking a little bit further out and saying what are our customers really wanting to do with this? And it's becoming a different conversation. Unlike any other technology conversation, it's sort of on its head. We start with the business problem and really don't talk too much about the tech because the blockchains are all either in purple or mauve. And other than that, let's talk about the business. So for us, we see it as sort of the beginnings of a core sort of infrastructure for the way business will be done across industries. I started out focusing solely on financial services. And it wasn't maybe a month or two into these, I was getting calls from pharmaceutical companies and business I really didn't understand and didn't know why they would be interested in blockchains. And once I started to understand and listen to the customers, like, oh yeah, well you could do that, and we quickly discovered that this is pervasive across industries. And I think one of the other interesting things about consortiums is a lot of times we focus on consortia within a use case within a single industry. But I think the more interesting ones, when we start looking at this, we're all from different, we have banks, we have larger industries. We'll start to see consortiums cross specific industries and be crossing like supply chain and trade finance and start to see these blending of healthcare and finance and so on. So we think it's going to be, we're just at I hate the analogy, tip of the iceberg, but that's really what we're looking at, a much broader sense of changing the way business is done collaboratively and thinking about how technology is different from it changes everything from distribution, but it also on the business side, distributed cost, distributed risk, distributed, who's going to own this, who's going to run it, how do we share infrastructure to do that. And I think Microsoft, we're uniquely positioned in the cloud in general, not just Microsoft, the cloud, the concept in general is a good place for this massive multi-party network to come together and sort of split the check, if you will, to move this forward.
So up till the advent of trust minimized or vertical computing, there was no way for competitors to trust one another in using shared infrastructure. And so everybody had to build their own systems, and the amount of redundancy that even within a bank that's rolled up many banks is just shocking. And so instead of companies building their own business systems, I think we're going to see whole industries building. Will be a massive sea change in how IT gets done.
I'll credit. I mean, J.P. Morgan. One of the favorite quotes that I use often is that I won't name the name, right? But someone from J.P. Morgan basically said, "We run a reconciliation business that does a bit of banking," right? And which I thought was, plays into that notion.
It wasn't me for once.
No, it wasn't.
That's great. That's true, and we have started doing some work between internal parts of the bank, and people have said when they first hear about it, why would you possibly do an internal use case? Why wouldn't you just throw a big, fast, centralized database at that? It seems like the right solution to the problem. But the answer is, we are kind of a microcosm of a much larger, the entire marketplace. And we've really been able to learn a lot there. We're running Quorum underlying a payments pilot that we're working on right now. Is there anything you, Marley, want to talk about there?
So I don't want to be shamelessly plugging it, but as of hopefully now, we are proud to announce that Quorum, I guess it's the first reference implementation or a starting point for the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, is now available in Azure. There's a blog post that hopefully just went live, and you'll be able to find Quorum. We'll have 2 deployments initially. One is a single node and then a 7-node Quorum network that you can spin up in minutes and with step-by-step instructions to get you up and running as quick as possible on Azure. So we're proud to announce that, and hopefully everyone will go out, click on it, and start playing with it.
That's great work, and it's taken a lot of work from a lot of people in this room to make that happen. It's not just up there kind of in a vacuum not being used, but you're going to get to see some work later in the day that we have gotten up and running on the Azure cloud using Quorum. And it's just great to see tangible examples of this moving forward. So day by day, good stuff. And to take it back to some of the organizational matters in Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, governance is a big kind of boogeyman keyword here. So bringing together enterprises and open source communities has always been a balancing act, and that is not something that's unique to the blockchain. And I think it's kind of doubly true for heavily regulated industries coming onto the scene. So Sandra, could you maybe speak a bit about the importance of governance standards and how we're going to balance the speed of innovation with the safety that we need?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a big challenge. Fintechs go fast. Big regulated entities like ourselves or JP Morgan or any others that are out there, it's very difficult to innovate at the pace that we would like to. We have to play within the lines, or color within the lines, as opposed to coloring outside the lines. But having said that, if we're going to create something like this alliance and work together, I think it's crucial that we figure out the best balance between keeping the likes of JP Morgan, CME Group, and others who are highly regulated, engaged with regulators, and making sure that education process is a continuous process, it's iterative, as well as balancing the fact that we need to motivate and encourage the developers who are doing the wonderful work that they're doing. So it's not going to be an easy one. I think what we've set up initially in terms of governance structure and the flexibility around that is great. What we will have to adapt as we go along. I think the regulator education component is key. And it's not just regulators. It will be ancillary bodies beyond the regulators where we will have to spend time and work to make sure that things that we are looking at and creating, that they understand at a level that, where we can have a frank and open dialogue.
I mean, I think one simple example of what Sandra's talking about is if we use the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance as an example. Jeremy didn't mention this earlier, but the first coming together of this group in person was in December. And I mean, I'm a small startup, so for me, it's relatively easy to make a decision and say, yep, we're going to do this. But for a JP Morgan or a CME or a Microsoft to commit to something like this and to be able to turn around a governance structure that I think is a relatively good starting point for what we're doing within the span of 2.5 months, I think is almost miraculous. Not to say that there wasn't some last minute scrambling to get everything kind of tied, all the knots tied before today. But this shows that we can follow the rules, we can play within the bounds, but we can do it relatively quickly from an enterprise perspective. because I don't think you'd find many other groups of companies coming together like this and getting everything in place, from the incorporation of a legal entity to membership agreements to confidentiality and IP, done within this short period of time. This would probably normally take about 6 months to a year. So we're demonstrating that with the way we're operating this, which I think is good.
Shout out to Matt Corva, legal superhero.
Yeah, shout out to a couple of the lawyers that are in the room who have been on many long calls about this, and much appreciated. So I guess it sounds like it's a pretty heavy lift to stand something like this up. And so I guess the next question in a little way is, why bother? We certainly heard from this morning a lot about what Ethereum might offer to enterprises, but what can enterprises offer back to Ethereum? And I kind of like to hear from a variety of people on the panel about this. But first, Joe, I'd like to hear from you a little bit, because it's easy for me to stand here and tell you what we think we can offer, but what is it that you think we should be contributing, and what is it that you need?
So enterprise represents mindshare. It represents resources. Ethereum has done a great job at building mindshare at the developer level. We have a developer tool called Truffle that has recently crested 40,000 downloads. We have a back-end infrastructure that gets 40 million requests per day from the public blockchain. In order to get the network effect, in order to push this technology out ubiquitously, we need to speak to everybody and enable everybody to use the system. In some of the earliest discussions about what Ethereum should be, we all came down very decisively on the fact that it should be inclusive in many ways. Some people early in the project weren't that excited about speaking with banks and similar institutions. But Vitalik has certainly been really clear about inclusiveness, and I'm of like mind as well.
That's great. Anyone else want to mention maybe why enterprises, what we'll be able to offer?
I mean, playing on one of Sandra's points, actually, I mean, the notion in the corporate enterprise world, we constantly operate within the framework and structures and boundaries and regulations and laws. There's enormous amounts of innovation that's coming from people who haven't suffered through that through their careers. And maybe I shouldn't be that dramatic about it, but there's enormous innovation that'll come from the enterprise, the public Ethereum development community, who's unencumbered from all of those orthodoxies and structure. But conversely, there's absolutely the learning and insights, and Joe's making the same point just slightly differently, that the insights and knowledge that comes from having to have operated within those constructs is going to be similarly valuable. And I think we saw that play out over the past 18 months, where initially all the startups ran at the banks with a big disintermediation message: we're going to take you out, and then that was soundly beaten back, and that pendulum swinging back and forth, right? It's and I think it's that interplay of that corporate institutional knowledge that has been stuck within that structure versus the unencumbered creativity that's coming from outside, where those two meet. I think the most interesting things will happen.
I had one of my first meetings with one of my banking clients was they presented me with a list of 14 issues, 14 problems that they had identified as to why this technology was going to be difficult to adopt, to implement, to actually see meaningful progress inside the bank. 12 of those issues were non-technical. 2 of those issues had to do with things like scalability, things like privacy, the things that we're talking about, the things that I can solve as an entrepreneur, as a tech company. The other 12 issues were legitimate business issues, bureaucracy, mass adoption, et cetera, things that are to a certain extent outside of the control of a technology vendor. So where enterprise can help is solve those 12 issues. All I can really do is bring forward a suitable solution that solves for you the 2 issues. But as we know, blockchains are not the first technology that can drive efficiencies in large enterprises. And large enterprises have had a hard time adopting other previous eras of technology that also could have driven efficiencies, that also could have brought a ton of value. So there's legitimate just business challenges and that these large enterprises are going to have to help us figure out. because that's not something we can solve on our own. So.
Yeah, I think it's a phenomenal point. I'm immediately reminded of how many of us have been in a situation where we're talking about a business transformation, a wider use case, right? And you draw the logical or technical architecture diagram, and you walk in and you start the discussion. And I've had, countless times I've had now someone say from the back of the room, well, where's the blockchain? I'm like, well, it's this little part down here, right? It's the data.
Yeah.
There is a wider construct of architecture and business, dimensions and the combinations of technologies that have to come together to achieve an overall business transformation. It's certainly not more than just the data, but there's always that astounding part of, well, you have to remember everything else that you need to plug it into to get the maximum value. So I couldn't agree more.
So can I add one quick thing related to Amber's question around what enterprise can bring? So, think about what we do. We have a business. Each of us at the enterprise level have businesses or various business lines. We have clients. And our client base actually are a lot of the biggest banks who are our clearing members. And we look at what their problems are. We look at how we can help them and solve for some of those problems and create efficiencies. There's a huge amount of cost pressures right now. Part of it regulatory driven, part of it post-financial crisis, remnants left over. But the point here is I think we know what the problems are. And when we go to unpack some of the bigger problems, we actually find there are problems upon problems upon problems. And the deeper you go into infrastructure, especially financial infrastructure, the more complex. And you realize you try to fix something over here, you might break something over here, and it is not just about solving for one thing. And I think this is where enterprises can help unpack the series of problems and entanglements and try to solve for these things where we start with a POC or a project, and it can grow to something much larger and more meaningful. But the reality is the level of detail and knowledge required from the business side is just as critical as the tech that would solve for that.
Yeah, I think I'll build on that. In defense of those complex enterprise systems, those systems were built for a reason, the way they were. I mean, we can look at them and criticize them, but everyone in this room has made like hack decisions in your life at some point in time where you're under pressure and you have to get something to work. And most people assume that enterprise systems are just fraught with those, and the truth is they're not. Those type of systems are built for a reason, and there are reasons that those constraints are there. And that friction is there, but the big learning I think from enterprises we talk about sharing technology and standards like that, but then we are looking at this higher level transformation of business processes within the enterprise. I think there needs to be a level of sharing of thought, not just within your enterprise organization or some smaller consortium, but out sort of in the public and air your dirty laundry of why things are the way they are. You don't have to get the technical details, but for people to sort of understand that, to understand the problem the way it exists today, or the business problem that exists today, to reinvent it for tomorrow, when you have numerous counterparties that are either competing with each other or collaborating, sharing that business level sort of architecture, if you will come from the Accentures and even the startups will go find those, but we need to start sharing at that level as well.
Yeah. So Consensus has learned a tremendous amount in our interactions with enterprise. First, enterprise runs businesses and has customers, and that's where many of the existing use cases are. We are also partnering to identify new use cases. We have been able to learn from our various engagements in payments, other forms of money movement, supply chain, energy industry applications. We've been learning how to build product from some of those engagements. Blockchain is a new sort of infrastructure on which to build applications. On the public blockchain, on average, we get a new block every 14 seconds. And so there are user experience and user interface issues that we've been able to think about and work on in the context of having real people using our systems, which is going to happen slowly on public blockchain, but is happening quickly in the private world.
Absolutely. And I mean, it does take time to change these things. I feel like we've gone through, it hasn't been that long that blockchain has been out in the press, but certainly the velocity of press coverage has been high. And now we're suddenly approaching it's been a year. Why isn't everything on a blockchain yet? Which, even if we were just migrating a traditional database, it would probably take us a year. When you're the largest US dollar clearer in the world, you certainly don't want to lose even a single one payment. Those sort of resilience and uptime and stability guarantees that we make are absolutely critical. So change there does take time. It's perhaps more splashy to do kind of the front end, user-centric, user design, refresh an interface, and just have a massive engine behind the scenes that's this legacy infrastructure. So transforming that is going to take us a longer journey. But I think that when we get this sort of solution right through this kind of collaboration, then the scale is already there. The infrastructure is already there. So very quickly, the adoption goes from a startup who might have been knocking on the door saying, how are we going to get this running on one system, to, yep, okay, we've got it. And now it's around the world. So, yeah, I'm going to say something on that? Oh, no. Well, I'm going to ask you the next question anyway. So too bad you're on the hot seat. So speaking of being a startup in the space, when you have people like Marley knocking on the door down there and getting interested, how do you make it an additive solution and not a competitive one?
Well, I mean, maybe to start, it would probably not be all that wise to try to make it a competitive one. When we started as only 10 months ago, we were a 3-person team. So to go out and suggest that we're going to compete with the likes of Microsoft would not have been a wise business decision. But at this point, I mean, we see a lot of overlap in terms of what we build and what enterprises need and what other more traditional technology vendors are building. Marley kind of referred to the idea of like a marriage between the cloud and blockchain systems. I think there's an obvious synergy that we can take advantage of there as a startup to make sure that we're kind of pegging ourselves to infrastructure that's already becoming familiar to enterprises, whether that's cloud infrastructure, whether that's ERP infrastructure, whatever that might be. I mean, these are natural additive components from our perspective. So that's where we're putting a lot of our focus, is instead of trying to build net new, build for additive. And even when we get down to use cases, I mean, most of the use cases that we think are kind of more short to medium term impact are not going to be how do you replace the way something exists today, but how do you allow for a new functionality that just wasn't previously possible without a distributed infrastructure. And the type of collaboration system that a blockchain allows you to build that wouldn't have been possible before, rather than let's go gut and replace a status quo technology. Over time, I think we'll get there, but now we're really trying to identify use cases that are not so they're not challenging status quo. They're adding functionality. So that's our perspective.
Absolutely. And then, so for both you and Joe, I guess, I'd like to hear your perspective about creating a business model around open source technology. And specifically within EEA itself, how are you looking at approaching that and being successful without having the core moneymaker be the protocol?
Can I address the previous one and then move into open source? So what we're doing with enterprise is certainly additive in the sense that we have partners like Microsoft and other large enterprises. In those situations, we're able to increase efficiencies, reduce redundancy, create new use cases. So additive in that sense. Rather than competitive, I prefer to think of it as evolutionary. So we are pioneering new ways of doing things. We are building collaborative systems instead of siloed systems. We are building systems for essentially the evolution of the infrastructure of the World Wide Web. So we've moved from a static web to an interactive mobile social web. Now we're moving to a World Wide Web that is decentralized, that is peer-to-peer instead of client-server, essentially. So in that context, you can imagine platforms with many different stakeholders, so end-sided markets. This is the vision that we care most about, and we also care about creating efficiencies and stepping stones towards moving in that direction. that we anticipate that we will evolve together with enterprise.
Absolutely. And how are you going to build a business model around that?
Business model around that? Build open platforms on top of open source systems, on top of open source platforms. So we are releasing very soon, or entering the token launch phase very soon of a project that we effectively have had in release for nearly 2 years. It's called Gnosis. It's a prediction markets platform. And the idea is to build an open, permissionless infrastructure on which we and many other entities can build services. And so one token launches that, creates perhaps a foundation, you might see the pattern, and enables the foundation, which is run ideally in time by broad stakeholdership, although we'll start with fairly centralized leadership, and enable it to take care of the platform while many businesses connect to it and build on it. We're doing similar things in ad tech, energy industry, etc. So I don't see any lack of opportunity as we convert the world from essentially one database technology to a new collaborative database technology.
Yeah, I think, at the core, what we're focusing on primarily, we obviously do application development with clients, but what we're focusing on primarily is how do we provide this infrastructure, maybe, as Marley said, infrastructure as a service is maybe not the best term for it, but and building that on top of open source technology is obviously one of the challenges we encounter often in terms of investors asking us, how do you monetize on something that is, essentially available in some form for free. Maybe it's not obvious, but I definitely represent the smallest company up here. I think I'm the youngest. I don't know how old Joe is. But yeah, I think, my I think my generation has a little bit of a different perspective on these things. I think collaboration and openness is a little bit more rooted in the way we do things. And we're starting to see that kind of seep its way, as David was mentioning, the concept of open source is seeping its way kind of in all aspects of industry. And it doesn't preclude us from saying, hey, I can build something proprietary that functions similarly to an open source function, but does it faster or does it more securely, and monetize on that. It also doesn't preclude us from saying, well, there might be a benefit to an enterprise to just know that although it's open source, somebody is taking care of it for you. The Red Hat model, kind of demonstrated that with Linux over the course of the last several decades. So, you look at companies like Cloudera that has created additive functionality on top of open source Hadoop, or companies like Red Hat that have created a very, very rich environment of services on top of open source Linux. So there's no shortage of ways to monetize. The obvious secondary perspective is that we can help clients build applications that they will then need to have managed and serviced and hosted, that we can help them with. So that's how we approach this. But the core of this being open source means that we get to take advantage of development and research that's being done by a broad community. So again, we're a small team. We have what I would consider extremely advanced technology, but not because we're the most brilliant team in the world, but because we got to piggyback off of the back of an $18 million Ethereum crowdfund that developed this great technology as a starting point. And then we could then say, well, now let's take it from here to here. And that's, if we had started from scratch and decided to build our own proprietary stack, we would have, in fact, had to start from scratch, and we probably have something that's nowhere near competitive with what's available on the market.
Absolutely. And in releasing Quorum to be open source as well, it's not necessarily profit motivated at the protocol level either. It's GPL licensed, but we want the thinking over time to start moving up that stack to the application and the business opportunities there. I mean, when I sit down to build a new web application or to design one with a business leader at the bank, I don't start by explaining TCP/IP to them. It wouldn't make sense. But that's where we are with blockchain. The first question we get is, are you mining? Where's the Bitcoins? So, we have a bit of work to do to get to the point where people stop wondering, how is this working, and can start thinking about just really the business application layer, and being comfortable that the underlying system is taken care of and will, quote unquote, just work.
And I think one of the things that we've noticed, whether startups or enterprise, and I kind of equate the two. You mentioned earlier the kind of lab concept inside these large corporations have a lot of similar characteristics to startups in terms of like their journey into a new technology. And what we heard recurringly in the Ethereum space specifically is, as excited as everybody was about it and as powerful as the technology seemed to be, there was an unnecessary friction to get started. How do I set this thing up? How do I run it? How do I make it stable? How do I create some parameters that allow me to create some privacy? All of these things that are unnecessary, that although the technology is freely available, anybody can go tweak it the way they want to tweak it, people will pay to not have to. And that's the business model, essentially. Like if I can just remove that burden from myself, if let's say I don't have the right engineering capabilities in-house because that's a specific layer of the stack that we don't hire for as an application company or whatever, then I can just pay somebody else who's more of a systems company to do that for me. You mentioned in the web space, I mean, it's the very same thing as how Heroku built a business model saying, don't worry about your backend, we'll do it for you. Just worry on building a web-based business and we'll take care of everything else. So I think there's a lot of similarities and comparisons that we can draw from that industry.
Yeah. So
in 2 or 3 years, Ethereum will have significant scalability and a robust privacy and confidentiality solution. And essentially, you can build, as an enterprise, you can build private permission systems, internal systems, or public-facing systems, and that requires significant cost in maintaining the infrastructure. So where we're moving is enabling systems that have all the privacy and the scalability that we're used to when delivering a proprietary solution for customers, but moving it to the public blockchain in some small number of years. So if I, as a developer, can package up my front end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, put it on Swarm, and have it everywhere, deliverable within a second, the real-time version, the up-to-date version of the interface. And if I can package up my backend in a transaction, as a payload of a transaction, inject it into the blockchain, and have that deployed around the world within a second, that reduces my infrastructure costs to pretty close to zero, yet it is more available, more fault tolerant, etc. So paying a decentralized global cloud, and many of the nodes will be in Azure and other clouds, and many of us will have the opportunity to run our own nodes, make sure that we're contributing to the infrastructure. That is, I think, the future of the World Wide Web and computing.
Does it plug into the LDAP?
We're not working on that.
There's a few enterprise challenges we have. So, David, you have a massive enterprise client base as well. So besides us on stage, kind of what are you hearing out there that gives you the indication that there is a broad base of support for an Ethereum alliance or Ethereum development in general amongst enterprises?
Yes. So as I said earlier on, right? It's been a multi-year kind of conversation now. It's been a multi-year awkwardness in the conversation, right? Of we engage with clients, and more our clients have advanced labs teams, right? The teams that have gone deep in technologies, and we engage and we get into these conversations and around choices, around code bases. Invariably comes too early in the conversation, right? We try to let's focus on what business transformation opportunities based on the concepts of this, but it gets in there really quite quickly. And for the past couple of years, it's been, well, hang on, for anyone who's engaged on their own, in many instances, individuals on their own, let alone teams, Ethereum has been a huge topic, right? It's a massive developer base. There's lots of innovation coming from it. Enormously creative and innovative things happening, and yet it was this gap in the conversation of up until recently, basically having to say, well, not really applicable right now, and so really quite excited to be able to bridge that gap and say enormously applicable. And let's get into it. So, I think it's been a really profound gap that bridging will help drive progress further, faster, better.
Absolutely. And Marley, same question. What are you hearing from enterprise clients?
Well, outside the fact that we can't handle all the inquests that come in, it's just been a tidal wave of customers. A lot of it's, people fear of missing out or having the give me a blockchain sort of thing. But what we've seen is what's really triggered us to say, this is really going to go somewhere. Is the conversations have moved out of I need to start up a lab to I want to take this into production and help me take this into production. Something we've never done before, and can you give it and to have the comfort level with like the Ethereum platform to see that not just targeting something to run side by side in production, but with an aggressive roadmap within 12 months to stand something up and tear something down that it can replace. And we've seen, we don't have a deluge of those, but we do have some extremely credible ones that have made us say, yes, he evolved into more than just labs, into people really going out there and doing something. That's been very heartening to see.
Absolutely.
No, I was just playing off kind of continuing that. I think part of the thing I'm really excited about for the next phase as well is the combinations of technology, right? So as people everyone's caught up the learning curve of the potential of distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, and you see blockchain teams focusing on blockchain answers. But quickly now that's kind of evolving into, well, hang on, what are the combinations of technology or where it gets interesting? And I think an opportunity for the alliance to start thinking about those interfaces as well as what does distributed ledger mean for AI and the ability to traverse data sets that potentially were very constrained based on historical organizational boundaries suddenly are unconstrained, and it's able other technologies. So those combinations and just building off that, I think that's one of the most exciting things to me about the next phase of where we're going with this.
Absolutely, and to the point of JP Morgan having a blockchain center of excellence right now, it's been a very exciting period in our innovation journey. But it is my desperate hope that I scale myself out of business. Because we do not have an internet center of excellence and we do not have a database center of excellence. So I think that the sign of success here will be simply that it becomes a tool that we use in the toolkit that's almost assumed or that's widely understood, and that the focus, again, goes back to really it's about the product and it's about solving clients' issues and bringing better service to the clients.
Can I just maybe slightly more cynical view on your original question? Why are enterprises, why is this a good idea for enterprises to get involved in Ethereum or for us to launch this alliance? I think there's kind of two things going on in this space. I mean, blockchains, distributed ledgers, they get kind of used very much as like this umbrella term. Any of us who are close to the technology know that, not all blockchains are built equal or created equal. And there's a little bit of a PR and credibility battle going on at the same time as a technology battle or protocol battle going on. And the old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying blank, blank, blank. That used to be a problem for the Ethereum community because it's such an unknown technology, such a novel, cutting edge thing that there was probably legitimate concerns as to the business credibility of getting involved in something that was so bleeding edge. So if anything, other than the technology and the roadmap that we're going to do as an alliance and the prioritization of like real technology milestones, this adds a sense of comfort to a large organization, a sense of credibility that what they're buying into is not so far-fetched and so out of the box that they're putting their career at risk or something like that. And I think that's going to be an enormous side benefit of this is that people can now start taking what we're doing seriously because, today versus yesterday, Ethereum technology has not changed. It was just as good as yesterday as it is today. But today, all of a sudden, we're going to have more interest in it. We're going to have more adoption of it. And I think that's a big part of what we're doing here.
Yes. One of the most powerful aspects of the integration of the enterprise focus and the public blockchain focus is what I just described. We are going to have a public infrastructure, public shared infrastructure on the Ethereum technology. and that enables startups now. It enables enterprise to build systems in a sort of intranet versus internet context, in a context that they can trust to be secure and scalable for their purpose for now, and then migrate their systems to the public blockchain when appropriate. There will be cases where every significant organization on the planet has a public-facing use case that properly belongs on a public blockchain system. There's only one viable platform currently, in my opinion, and it doesn't make sense if you're, and to me, but I may be biased, it doesn't make sense to if you're an enterprise or if you're a startup, to build on a technology, a blockchain technology stack that can never have a public blockchain solution, because the crypto economics of going from private to public are next to impossible.
And we have just about 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm not sure if we wanted to go to lunch or if we just wanted to keep it at an hour. I'm sure someone will wave at me at some point. But okay, so we're just going to give a couple of minutes for questions in the room. If there was anybody, feel free. Yes, go ahead.
It seems to me that you're hitting the ground running.
Is it on?
I don't think that's
Can
on.
you hear me now?
I think we can hear you, but the rest of the room.
Just talk really loud.
No, it's not on.
Can we get the mics, the room mics, active?
Oh,
We can just repeat the question.
Okay, we can repeat the question. And if you're comfortable, if you want to mention your institution, that's helpful.
okay, great. So it seems to me that you're hitting the ground running. So although it looks like you're launching today, you're not really, because lots of pieces were already happening. You had lots of momentum, and you're just adding some order and synergy to what's already being done. So my question to you is, can you talk more about your governance process, and how do you plan on staying nimble and staying fast in terms of decision making and resolving potential conflicts so you can continue to improve at that same speed that the Ethereum ecosystem has been innovating on?
I mean, just at a very high level, and then maybe Matt would be good to answer this more fully. We have the governing board, which was discussed a little bit this morning, but there is also the real core technical working group, and that is a kind of duocracy join. Likely, we're figuring out exactly how public open source is, but that is where the larger development roadmap and collaboration comes from. It's not a top-down sort of governance board model, and the governing board really is there to resolve disputes if they should arise, so that someone ultimately can help us move forward, but is not there to ultimately set the agenda. We'll have the industry working groups that Jeremy had mentioned to make sure that we're thinking about, say, EEA within finance, and that we have the right group of people in the room there. But how that gets interpolated into the reference spec is going to be a relatively organic sort of developer-led process.
And just to add to the sensitivities, the group has actually put in a lot of thought around how do we make the governing board not a top-down organization, but actually quite flat. And the concept of rotating out 6 out of the 11 in a year's time, the constant rotation of different types of institutions as they come in to be able to participate. The governing board is really very much an administrative sort of, how to keep things moving forward kind of board. It's not we make decisions and dictate down. I think that is absolutely the antithesis of what the institutions want. And so guiding principles are going to be really about the collaborative and the importance of the tech subcommittee or committee to drive the innovation. And it's really the governing board's about let's just moving it forward from an administrative standpoint as we bring in more institutions.
We are taking decentralization seriously. Everything starts centralized, starts as an idea, it starts with one person, and that happened. And we, as Ethereum, governance is moving towards decentralization, or at least that has been the goal right from the start. This group will move towards decentralization and push as much decision making as possible into the working groups where the work is going on. We are still discussing how all of this gets resourced with respect. So we wanted to keep it small and we wanted to make good progress. And as a result, lots of different organizations committed resources in the form of personnel, and that worked really beautifully. So we anticipate that there will be some small amount of funds necessary to run the organization-wide infrastructure, but we may end up experimenting with a model where essentially if you're in a working group and you want to see this project get done, contribute resources in the form of personnel, money, other things, and we're going to run ideally with that for as long as it works. We may have to move to a situation where we have fees, but we're not there yet. With respect to transparency of decision making and collaboration in decision making, this is a small plug for Consensus Boardroom. It is not decided at all that we'll use a blockchain-based decision mechanism, but we have demonstrated for the group a blockchain-based decision mechanism.
I think we also have our first data point. I mean, the ability, as it was said earlier, right? The ability to go from December till now and get from there to here. You know, I think all of us were impressed with the way that happened and we came together and and we continue in that style and mode, right? That I think we're gonna value what that was and keep doing it.
You mentioned with the
It's on.
It's on. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yep. There you go.
You mentioned it a little bit with Boardroom at the comment at the end there, but has there been any thought given to perhaps using a DAO-like model for this and actually using a sort of a DAO 2.0 to govern enterprise Ethereum?
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, Boardroom, I won't use that word to refer to it because there's some negative connotations associated to that in an enterprise room with maybe some regulators present. So decentralized governance, in terms of a voting mechanism based on kind of stake in a decision, yes. But I mean, the reality is we're a legally incorporated nonprofit. We have legal requirements. We need, that's the reason we have a board of directors for other reasons as well. But a big part of that is what are we required to do by law for operating in the United States. But as Joe mentioned, the idea is pass a lot of that decision making down, and to the extent that the decision making could gain efficiency by being put onto one of these systems, one of these platforms, then yeah, we're going to look at it pretty closely.
Yeah, there's some value to having a bit of a hybrid model because even something as simple as ordering lunch here, I need to have a name to put on the line, and it needs to be something that resolves to someone that has an address somewhere.
And they don't accept Ether.
And they don't accept Ether.
Yeah.
So there's value in having the security. Yes, thank you for everyone for getting through security today. I know it was rough. Anyway,
I think it's probably also worth mentioning. We mentioned very high level that there is a board of directors in place. Yeah. It's a rotating board. I mean, the intention is that the board is not a stagnant thing that stays there forever, and that if you're on the board, you're there forever. So in the membership documents that you'll have received as organizations, you'll see that there is a baked-in rotation of the board to allow for new members to be proposed to the board, to allow for old members to be kind of rotated off the board. So that's part of the thought as well.
So the Boardroom is a platform for decentralized governance, which, as you know, is sort of half of what the DAO was. The other half is a crowdfunding mechanism, which we basically, the same team has built that, and that's called Wayfund. At EdCon, the Ethereum conference in France, Nick Dodson and Dino Mark demoed a project. I'm forgetting what they're calling it. It's essentially a project which builds a better DAO, an attempt to take the name back, to make the DAO strong again. And essentially, we're going to pioneer this mechanism. My issues with the DAO when it came out was that there was no great discussion mechanism. There was no, the decision-making mechanisms were flawed. But it was really exciting to see how much interest it drew worldwide and how much money people were willing to put into to build the infrastructure. So we're targeting this thing towards a small DAO-like project focused on building Ethereum developer resources, essentially. So we'll run that. It won't be $150 million worth. It'll be much, much smaller than that. One could imagine taking that system and maybe using it at the working group level, where working groups essentially put their money into the financial element of that project and govern it with board.
Now the consideration around decentralized governance specifically now is around the technical working group. So as we decide on what do we want to prioritize on the technical roadmap, that's where we've discussed decentralized governance as a starting point, but it could very easily kind of trickle into other areas. But
yeah, and for the highly regulated members, we'll be participating in whatever is actually feasible, and if that requires proxies through traditional legal means or whatever that means, that is what we will be adhering to. So the experimentation at some point will have boundaries for us.
Yeah,
but
we'll still take U.S. dollars.
I guess they're still good, right? I saw one question all the way down there.
Yeah, hi, Brian Kelly, BKCM. Joe, this question's for you. You, at the end, mentioned that the crypto economics of moving from a private permission blockchain to a public blockchain would be impossible. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that for me, because I didn't quite understand what you're trying to say.
So essentially, the public Ethereum blockchain is secured by the miners currently, and will be secured when we move to proof of stake by validators that accomplish the same purpose. So you really need to incentivize these entities to do the work for you. It's not impossible for, let's say, Fabric version 1 or version 2 or version 3 to build an infrastructure like that. Brian Bellendorf, friend, just awesome technologist. He could change his mind potentially, but he has stated on many occasions that there will be no hypercoin, that there will be no attempt to build crypto economics into their systems. They're solely focused on enterprise architectures.
So we're just at lunchtime here, so maybe I can go ahead and take one more question since you've been so patient, and then we're going to wrap. Go ahead.
If the DAO, if this organization had been in place
Could the
at the
question
time,
not be about the DAO? No, I'm just kidding.
I'm very curious about this. If this organization had been in place at the time that the DAO happened, what would have been different?
Let me get out the crystal ball. I mean, nobody wants.
I'm not sure anything to be. I think the priorities and mandate of this organization are quite different. At least in the first, in our first phase of having an EEA, is really to target the specific needs of what enterprises need now, and that means that what they need now tends to be on the side of the spectrum of permissions environments, private transactions, better transaction throughput, things like that. That's where our, call it phase 1 priorities are going. Not to discount the fact that kind of phase N is to find these synergies between the public and private environments. But I think if we were doing this, or if the DAO was happening right now, I'm not sure that it would really impact what we're doing, other than maybe some need for clarification and messaging to the press. But other than that, technically, in substance, I'm not sure that there would be much difference.
Yeah, I mean, to Jeremy's point this morning, I also have a picture of 1969 ARPANET in my office as well, connecting the 4 nodes, right? And that is what we are building at this point within enterprise. We're working on building these intranets. We will test them and prove that that facilitates not only the technical needs that we have, but that it fits in with the business requirements and can have legal and regulatory acceptance. And then at some point over time, those islands of intranets will begin connecting, perhaps. I mean, the perspective, I think, from an enterprise standpoint, or at least a highly regulated one, is that anything that has to do with public chain, we're talking years and years away, and this is wild speculation. So.
Yeah, the DAO is basically a baby learning to walk and bumping into a table and hitting its head really hard.
And with that, lunch?
So in the context of the DAO and the responses to the DAO, where we have so many more cybersecurity researchers paying attention, this space, this ecosystem is growing up. There will be enough infrastructure in place and enough knowledge, experience in place so that those kinds of things will, I think, be less likely and less necessary over time.
Maybe a final snarky comment, because I have a very Ethereum perspective. Let's say the DAO had put at risk about $60 million, or for argument's sake, $59 million. There's been other blockchain projects that have spent equal amounts of money in their learning process. So, from that perspective, it's a great opportunity for us. We learned a lot, and we're moving forward.
Thank you.